Hello and welcome to the Vancouver branch of the Canadian International Council's special lunchtime event, Coping on the Coast, the Big One and International Disaster Relief. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is an unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My name is Charles Dumbrill, and I'm the fresh new branch president and moderator for today's event. Thank you for being here. We know you have the choice on where to be, and we promise to make the next hour overflowing with content. Promise?
Yep, promise.
Scientists predict a 1 in 3 chance that an earthquake strong enough to cause significant damage will hit the North American West Coast in the next 50 years. What better spot than being in the basement of a century-old building? The question is, can we cope? Sudden onset natural disasters impose substantial disruptive burdens on the societies impacted. A massive earthquake off the west coast of the North American continent would plunge the Canadian economy into a deep financial crisis, as warned by a recent report by the CD Howe Institute. Earthquakes and ensuing tsunamis and other aftershocks endanger the future of the developed land, homes, and infrastructure on the West Coast, both in Canada and the United States. For many years, this has been a known risk, and recent worse-than-expected earthquakes and other natural disasters, such as those that struck Japan and New Zealand in 2011, and most recently in Italy in August and the end of October, and again this past weekend in New Zealand, have put the issue back in front focus. We've organized a high-profile panel for today. You all have their biographies in your event notice, except for Kirk, who was the last minute, was able to join us. Last but not least. First to speak is the Honourable Naomi Yamamoto, MLA and BC Minister of State for Emergency Preparedness. Now, don't be alarmed, she has to run out at 12:35, so if you see her run out the door, don't panic. She just has another meeting she has to run to. Joanna Wagstaff, CBC Senior Meteorologist and Seismologist, and Kirk Heaven, Assistant Chief Emergency Operations at Vancouver Fire Rescue Services, and Hussar, Vancouver Service Task Force Leader. For those that don't know, the Heavy Urban Search and Rescue Hussar Task Force is a special operations team of up to 120 members with medical, fire suppression, emergency response, search and rescue, and engineering backgrounds. The task force rescues victims from major structural collapses and other hazards. We have a real hero here today. It is one of the 4 heavy urban search and rescue teams able to deploy anywhere in Canada, and only Canadian team certified to deploy around the world by the coordinator for UN emergency response. Please welcome our panelists. Your Honor, I'll let you start off. I'd like to go.
Great.
Green on the bottom?
No. There it is. Well, good evening, or good afternoon, everyone. And so just so you know, this is the first time I've met Johanna and Kirk. And Johanna, everybody knows because we've seen her on TV. And the recent podcast that Johanna's hosted, absolutely fantastic. I've listened to all of them. And if you haven't, I'm going to toot her horn. You really should. And a lot of the things that Johanna has done has really influenced how I felt and what I've done in government. So thank you for that leadership. And Kirk, I don't know about Johanna, but this is as close to heaven as I've been.
I'm right there.
His last name is Heaven.
Yeah.
I should have explained that better. So in July of last year, the Premier called me to her office, and I didn't know that we were in the middle of a little cabinet shuffle. In fact, I bumped into Mike Bernier, the MLA for Dawson Creek as well in the area, and I thought, and I asked him what he was doing there, and he said, I don't know, I was told to the Premier's office too, 15 minutes after my appointment, so I thought that's kind of strange. So I just walked in, and he was actually later appointed the new minister responsible for education in BC, a huge job. And the Premier sat me down and said, you know, I've got a new role for you in cabinet. And she created the first, we believe, the first and only position in cabinet in Canada, for certain, where you have one minister responsible solely for emergency preparedness. And it's not like we haven't been doing that in government before. It was under our Attorney General, who also had the role of public safety at the time. And emergency management BC was within her portfolio, which is great. And she always knew it was running really well. But having a minister and a deputy minister, a fabulous deputy minister, Becky Denlinger, actually have the sole responsibility. It's the only thing that I care about doing. It's quite unique, and I think the Premier had a lot of vision in this, and she said, frankly, it was keeping her up at night. And then she gave me that article called The Really Big One, or The Really Big One, written by Catherine Schultz. And she said to me, don't read it now, read it when you go home. And she said, this will keep you up at night. And it actually won a Pulitzer Prize, so it was very well written, and that was kind of the basis or the start of this role for me. So you will know that each year we have thousands and thousands of earthquakes in British Columbia. Regrettably, we don't feel them. And regrettably, not regrettably, thankfully, they don't do any damage. But it's also been a big challenge. So unlike jurisdictions like New Zealand and Chile and obviously a lot of places in California and Japan, who get daily or weekly reminders of earthquakes, we don't do that here. So one of the challenges that I'm facing as a minister responsible for this portfolio is to raise the awareness of the importance of being prepared for the next big earthquake. So Charles already mentioned it's a 1 in 3 chance that in 50 years we'll have a significant event. You know what, if it doesn't happen in your lifetime or our lifetime, it'll probably happen in your children. So think about that. Charles, you already mentioned the earthquake, the recent earthquake in New Zealand. There's nothing like social media now to bring you right to that moment. I remember clicking on a tweet that showed a video, and then more important, the sound of this tsunami sirens going off, quite chilling. And it happened at night, also increasing uncertainty. And those are the type of things that I think are good reminders to us that we need to be prepared. My aunt and uncle were in Christchurch in 2011, in February, right in the town center when they had the huge earthquake. So, and they couldn't actually go back to their hotel. It was too badly damaged. They never got back to their hotel. And one thing I know for certain, that if we aren't totally prepared, and this group is probably a different group, you're probably a lot more prepared than most folks. What I know is that people will be there for each other. So this absolute stranger saw that my aunt and uncle, who were elderly in their 80s, visitors, said to them, I'm going to take you home with me. So they didn't have to sleep in the community center, whatever it was that they had set up temporarily. And then I know what happened in BC, and I know if we were to experience a significant earthquake, but we need to be prepared. Because one thing we hear from folks who have survived and gone through these events is the same refrain, and that is, I wish I was more prepared. So I spend a lot of time telling people to make sure they have an emergency kit, and I will be the first one to tell you that my emergency kit at home before I got this role was probably 10 years out of date, and it had a tin of plum pudding. Yeah, Christmas plum pudding in it. Because I think I thought, well, it's in a tin. It'll probably last over a long time. It's not my favorite food, but I didn't want to throw it out. And I'm sure that was probably not edible. But we have prepared some resources in government that we're trying to make available to people, or that we are making available to people. So these are resources for people who live in houses, and also acknowledging that a lot of people live in townhouses and condos. They have different needs for being prepared, so there's a separate guide for folks who live in townhouses and condos. Another guide to help people be prepared for major events or significant events we have another guide for people who have pets. And that's a reminder for any of you who have an emergency kit, make sure you have food in there for your pet, should something happen. Most recently, we're really proud of a plan that we created, and that's called the BC Earthquake Immediate Response Plan. And that's something we never had in the province. And last year is when we released it. It's a comprehensive plan. What we do know, though, is those are just words on paper. And if we don't exercise elements of that plan, that's all they are. So I tell people, it's like trying to figure out if you can really learn to drive by just reading a driver's manual. That's not going to work. You got to do that. But you really need to exercise these things. And in this case, we invested $1 million recently, actually in June of this year, over $1 million, in an exercise called Coastal Response. This was our BC's first, largest, full-scale response to an earthquake and a tsunami. And it was centered mainly out of Port Alberni, which is, many of you may recall, experienced, I think it was 1964, 1963, a huge tsunami that went through town.
We were there.
You were there?
Yeah.
So I talked to a woman who was there. She was, I think she said she was 8 or 9 years old. Her parents lived up on a hill in Port Alberni, but they sent her down to visit with her aunt who lived by the water, and to stay overnight. And she recalls vividly the tsunami coming in, and then it was at night. It was dark, obviously, and having to go up on the roof of her house. And then, I mean, she said she doesn't really know how this must have felt, but her father racing down, not knowing if she had, survived the tsunami. So that's amazing. I'd love to talk to you about that later. So the exercise really tested our plan. It involved 60 agencies. Can you imagine that? 60 agencies. Over 800 people were involved in this. 260 volunteers. A lot of them that were made up in that mirage, that makeup where you look like you've been burned or you've got compound fractures or you name it. So the whole town was involved in this. It was an overwhelming success in the sense that it raised awareness of the importance of being prepared for Port Alberni, certainly in that area. But it also, the over 1 year long planning process brought together organizations and agencies that really needed to connect. And one of the things that this plan did tell us was that we needed to do more of that. So when I say it's a success, it's not that we nailed everything. In fact, if we had nailed everything, it probably would push us outside of it. So there were a lot of great learnings that developed from that. So the topic of this whole session is, can we cope? I hope we can. I think we can. And there are some things that we've done as a province to, make sure that we're addressing something. So the provincial emergency notification system, invested some money in that to broaden that scope. We've invested as a province, the government, over $17 billion in infrastructure. That's schools and hospitals, transportation, infrastructure. And we've also increased our personnel at Emergency Management BC and looking at increasing even further shortly. The public awareness campaigns, little ones, just like the high ground hike in Tofino, is so important. And that's where we brought a whole bunch of elementary school students down to the beach, pretended that there was a tsunami coming up, and then we went up and we actually hiked to high ground so that they knew exactly where they would be safe. Again, building that kind of muscle memory. So those are some of those little things that we try to do in the province, but actually had a significant impact. Shake Out BC in October was another one. We had 800,000 people in British Columbia involved in this program, in this exercise. That's part of a 60 million worldwide exercise. And I walk into rooms now and I think, that's pretty sturdy. I think that would be a good one to get cover and hold on. Recently, a Vancouver TV station asked their viewers how prepared they were for an earthquake. So 34% said they were absolutely not. Said not at all. That's not surprising to me, but half said they were somewhat prepared. Only 13% colleagues who interviewed me, and I did embarrass him, but I asked him if he was prepared, and it was we're quite thrilled. If he had an emergency at home, and he said no. Right? Two of your colleagues actually, they went on radio, went on TV, and they're not prepared.
Oh, we gave him a hard time.
Did you? Excellent. I didn't ask him on TV about that. But I think what you're doing is really moving that needle to elevate the awareness and the importance of being prepared. So thank you for that name. Inside government, we're working collaboratively and collectively with those outside of government that share our interest in seismic monitoring. And one of the recent developments is RVOI, Request for Expression of Interest, from the private sector, from academics, to look at providing us some options on what we can investigate. And that's just, there's another side of the monitoring program that's also part of that. So I don't want to speak too long because I know you've got the other folks here. I do want to say though that my interest also lies in making sure that businesses, and especially small and medium-sized businesses, but small businesses in particular, are prepared. And that's a needle that's not budging very much right now. But when you look at what happened in San Francisco in 1989, they are like 50% of the small businesses didn't survive. And not that they were damaged beyond repair, but they just weren't prepared, and they weren't. It's usually cash flow. By the time the business is able to get the money again, weren't able to make it. And if you look at the economic losses with the Tohoku earthquake in Japan a few years ago, 2011 wasn't a very good year. It was $147 billion of economic loss, and that doesn't include the equipment and inventory. So we know it's huge, and a lot, 98% of businesses in BC are small businesses. So I think I'll just end it there by saying that it's the responsibility of all of us to be prepared at all levels of government, as well as individuals and communities and neighborhoods, and that British Columbia is prepared to lead, and we are doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here to talk to you today, and I totally agree that this is really, I'm pleased to see that this is a conversation that people want to have, and each one of you are here because you're interested in having this conversation. So thanks for having me here to talk. And it's true, we have never met before in person, even though as a journalist we talk often, and I feel honored to be sitting here with two people who I know are making a huge difference when it comes to earthquake preparedness. And as a journalist, I actually sort of remain unbiased, but as a scientist, it's really nice to be able to have an open conversation, with government about on the science side, what's being done. And I'm very interested to hear the boots on the ground side of things as well. It was a big part of my research into the podcast that I did about BC's preparedness for a big earthquake. So this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, if you haven't heard that already. My background is in geophysics, so my scientific background is in the study of earthquakes before I went into meteorology. So I spent a huge part of my career at CBC talking about earthquakes that happen in other parts of the world. My first big earthquake that I covered from Toronto, from CBC, was Haiti in 2010. And I was blown away by how catastrophic this disaster was. It was I think it's magnitude 7 earthquake, so not relatively massive, but it was a disaster that the country is still recovering from today. A year later, the 2011 earthquake hit Japan, and that earthquake was magnitude 9, 1,000 times stronger than the magnitude 7. And I mean, it was devastating, possibly one of the biggest modern disasters. But 1,000 times stronger, and that country, the progress that they have made already in recovering, I mean, you couldn't pick two more different countries as far as their resiliency. And obviously they're very different countries, developed and developing, but the contrast for me was so stark. And I went to Japan just a few weeks after that earthquake, And then I went back again just a couple of years ago, and to see the progress that they've made in recovering and rebuilding was incredible. And then you look at other countries that will take decades to get back to where they were. In fact, Christchurch, which I would like to talk more about, their experts say they won't get back to where they were before the 2011 earthquake for another 50 years. So I think resiliency is a big part of the solution. And I do want to talk about the differences between some of these countries, but as far as preparedness goes. But from a scientist's perspective, from a science level, there is so much that we are learning every time an earthquake happens somewhere else in the world. And that's always surprising to me. First of all, how much we do know. Geophysics is a relatively new field. I mean, we really only discovered that there were different layers in the Earth in the 1960s. And we're continuing to learn more and more about the Earth every day. But it also surprises me how much we don't know. And I've got to give you a few examples when it comes to the science. So the Italy earthquake, the series of earthquakes that are happening in Italy, basically since 2009, scientists are learning that these earthquakes are actually triggering a domino effect down fault lines, and they're not sure if the stress is being transferred northward through the country. And scientists all around the world, including Canadian scientists, are examining that to figure out if that's something we should be worried about. Would a 6 or 7 magnitude earthquake trigger more earthquakes down a particular fault line? Going back to New Zealand, first of all, the 2011 earthquake, we knew that liquefaction was probably a big concern for parts of the south coast. But to see it in a place so similar to Vancouver, such a similar soil type to Vancouver and Victoria, and to see these pictures where mud made recovery such a difficulty, and the water that was being forced out of the ground, basically the shaking causes the water to get squeezed out to the surface and punch through buildings and roads, and the damage to the infrastructure was tenfold because of liquefaction. So that forced our scientists to review our own hazard maps. And then in just last week, the 7.8 magnitude earthquake in New Zealand, something else that we had never really seen to this scale before, the 7.8 earthquake, actually 2 earthquakes happening at the same time on 2 different fault lines. And they're not sure these fault lines were side by side, if one triggered another one, but these 2 fault lines ripped a 200 kilometer section in the earth on the South Island of New Zealand, and that whole 200 kilometer section ruptured by, they're still analyzing it, by maybe 10 meters. But again, this concept of one fault line triggering another is something that now scientists are looking into. And the last one that really connects on a scientific level to the South Coast is Japan. So just last year, Japanese seismologists released a paper that basically connected every megathrust earthquake around the world, so these magnitude 9 earthquakes, with an event called slow slip. So basically when these 2 plates are moving together, like what's happening off of our coast right now, you get the plate that's sitting on top, Vancouver Island in this case, you get slow movement backwards as that plate's trying to force itself underneath. And every so often, that plate sort of settles back into place. It's called slow slip. You can't actually feel it, but we can detect it on our seismometers. There's hundreds or thousands of these small tremors that our instruments can pick up, but we can't actually feel. And these Japanese seismologists learned that every time there was a megathrust earthquake, it was during one of these slow slip events. And that's something that our seismologists here on Vancouver Island, they can study. They know exactly when these events begin. In fact, the last one we had was in February. And now we know that if we're going to get the big one, it's going to be during one of these slow slip events. So, learning from other scientists and collaborating with the research around the world has led to different, emergency groups talking about, well, maybe we need to do most of our drills or practices or refresh, drop cover, and hold on during one of these slow slip events that happen roughly every 14 months. And I mean, if you happen to be in the process of a drill when it happens, then that timing is not a bad thing to line up. So the collaboration amongst scientists, I think, is a big part internationally. And in fact, next week we've got Japanese scientists and engineers coming to talk to our engineers and seismologists about what they've learned after their earthquake. So that's that's something big on the science level, but as far as preparedness goes, I sort of touched on the difference between Haiti and Japan, but I want to start with Christchurch because in all of my research, most of the engineers I talk to say that Christchurch is the example for what could happen to the South Coast because of the way that our buildings are built, our building codes, our infrastructure, our soil type, the type of earthquakes we get. Just like Christchurch, we can get deep, large earthquakes or shallow, smaller earthquakes, and Christchurch has now seen them all, and we're in that same risk. So what happened to Christchurch in 2011 is the example for what could happen to us. And in Christchurch, they didn't expect an earthquake. They knew they lived in a seismically active area. There had been earthquakes in other parts of New Zealand, but Christchurch didn't get the rumblings, those reminder earthquakes you talk about. And so the people I talked to and the general reaction was people were surprised and unprepared. And since then, the rebuilding of Christchurch has turned that city into something that is unrecognizable. You know, nobody will build above a certain height now. The building codes have changed. They no longer build close to running water or liquefaction areas. As a result, the city has these, gaping holes in it, these lots where people won't build anymore. And what was once a city that looked very similar to Victoria now is sort of sparse. And there's different projects coming forward. I think one's called Fill the Gap, and they're working on different projects where they can build something to fill in those empty spaces where engineers won't build anymore. So after the 7.8 earthquake last week, a lot of people in Christchurch felt it, 90 kilometers from the epicenter, but that much farther away meant that they didn't see the damage, and people said the aftershocks and the earth and the shaking of the ground brought them right back to that day, but they knew what to do this time. And the recovery effort across the country has been a big step up from 2011, and interestingly, this is a great connection today. I don't know how many of you might have heard that one of our Navy vessels, HMCS Vancouver, happened to be on the way to Auckland to celebrate their 75th anniversary of their Navy fleet when the earthquake happened. And so New Zealand radioed them and said, actually, can you come to the South Island and help us in the disaster? So they just arrived last night, actually, and they have I think a Sea King on board. They've got supplies and different tools to help with the evacuation process. So kind of neat that as we're having this conversation, Canada is in New Zealand right now helping. Just another couple of quick examples. So Christchurch, I think, is the closest example to us. Japan, I think, is a country that has always had earthquake preparedness top of mind for decades. They've been working with the latest technology and research and preparedness amongst their people. They do get these earthquake reminders all the time. But in 2011, all of their earthquake and tsunami simulations showed that the tsunami would not top the dikes and levees that they had in place in Fukushima, and the tsunami swept past those dikes. So it just goes to show no matter how prepared you are scientifically, there is always an element of the unknown, and that's where it comes down to individual preparedness. The last country I sort of want to talk about is Chile. And that's a country sort of, I think, in between Christchurch, who's unprepared, or Haiti, and Japan, who has always been working on preparedness. Chile didn't put earthquake preparedness at the top of their priority list until 5 years ago. They had I think it was an 8.4 magnitude earthquake, 500 people were killed, tsunami swept on shore, a lot of people were killed. And after that, this was 6 years ago, the government decided to make it a priority, people decided to make it a priority. And they invested in technology, tsunami warnings to every cell phone, building codes, meaning that buildings would withstand a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. And since then, they have now become one of the most prepared countries. So it just goes to show you what can happen in a short amount of time. And to end on a positive note, I feel really positive about where we are in talking to planners and individuals and boots on the ground and government. I think we've decided to make this a priority, and this earthquake early warning system, the first steps towards that, is a huge move in the right direction, in my opinion. So I feel positive about it, but in analyzing all the different countries around the world who have dealt with something like this, it ultimately does come down to the individual. You can be as prepared as you want or not prepared, but at the end of the day, you sort of have to decide, are you going to be somebody who relies on a system, or are you going to be somebody who helps your community to recover? So thanks for letting me chat and looking forward to talking more later.
That's great. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm going to follow up on this. Wow. My name is Kirk Evan. I'm the training officer for all the special operations in the city of Vancouver, as well as I'm the manager of our heavy urban search and rescue team, Canada Task Force 1. We are one of 4 teams in Canada with a specialty in Reading and 5th in Montreal in 2017. What we're comprised of, our team is Vancouver firefighters, British Columbia ambulance, Vancouver police, city engineers, members, and we're all trained instructional collapse technicians built for earthquakes, what our visual mandate is. On that team, we have some very interesting people. We have a fellow that some of you might know, Dr. Terry Advar. He's a engineer on at UBC. He's one of our engineers who will deploy with our team. We have several doctors on the team who are surgeons, or one's in charge of BGH, emergency. We have some high-end people that come with us. We are a self-supporting team. We can be deployed with about 70 people. We're fully contained on our own. We make up our own city. We bring our own shelters, our own water. We bring our own food, bring our own heaters, everything you can possibly need. We bring. We actually set up a small little hospital, which is for our members themselves, but we are capable of treating people if those capabilities are there or needed. We were the first and had the opportunity to be involved in the exercise over in Port Alberta. I was fortunate enough to be there right from the beginning when we first started out, and I was lucky enough to design our portion of it. So we were there for well over a year, back and forth designing this, and we reached out to as many partners and people that we thought we could in the communities to either help us out or who would be affected. First Nations were fantastic. We did several scenarios with them with the Shot First Nations, which they happen to be going through some flooding issues right now. So the relationships we made, I talk to the person over there all the time, so it's been fantastic. We've engaged the Canadian Coast Guard. We've had opportunities with them to use their hovercraft to bring our teams over. We used our helicopter in a mock emergency to take one of our members who was injured back to the hospital. So we encompass a lot of different specialties. We can do, our team can be deployed to floods, building collapses, as I say, earthquake is our big one. So we have all the tools, capabilities to respond anywhere in Canada or abroad if we are called upon to do that. One of the interesting things was, recently I was back in Fort McMurray. We have an agreement between our teams that if there's any deployment of the teams, that representative from each team will go. So I went back to Fort McMurray on day 2, and it took us a day to actually get into Fort McMurray. The experience that we learned from there, was it an earthquake? No, it's not. It's going to be some of the same experiences we will definitely have if we have an earthquake. And that was going to an area that had nothing. There was nobody there. You know, we had to set up an EOC. Let's start doing command. We had no material. We had no idea of the area. We had to learn all that on the fly. So we were doing that for a week doing that. So the experiences that brought is, if it does happen, it will take time to get us all into gear, to get helping people out. Big takeaways is people should be self-sufficient. We tell people to prepare. People have to take a little bit of responsibility themselves and be somewhat prepared, because if this happens as bad as the thoughts of it are going to be, we all have to be prepared, and somebody's not going to be there right away to help you out. This will take time. So these experiences help me out. The Calgary floods, I was there for 2 weeks as well. Same issues again. People are out of their house for a long, long period of time. Lots of takeaways, and one of the interesting ones is from my travels down the States, working with FEMA and the Homeland Security is some of the ones. The most interesting one I find now is pets. My experience in Fort McMurray, we were able to get a pet lamb in 30 minutes. The reason for that was our contacts that we have, because nobody's prepared for pets. We're prepared to have maybe a little bit of food if we take them with us, but the pets who get left behind, who takes care of them? Pet people with special needs, who takes care of them and their pet? There's so many dynamics just in the pet plan itself that we have to start touching on. So this is huge. I thank the province for giving us the opportunity to be over in Port Alberta, because this was a major event in order for preparations, and I think we're so much farther ahead from learning what we didn't know compared to what we knew. We knew what was going to go right. We didn't have a clue what was going to go wrong, and that's how we all learned in our after-action report. So that was very important. I was over in Victoria 2 weeks ago for a conference, and we were going over the overall exercise after-action report. And some of the things we found were very interesting, because all teams were doing it. All the EOC, Emergency Operating Center, was having the same issues that we were having. And the biggest one is always going to be communication. The second one's communication. The third one's going to be communication. It's always going to be communication issues. On our end, on our team, we've dealt with that. So we've changed our procedures, but it will be an issue. The interesting thing about Christchurch was texting. Texting was actually able to be used most of the time. It went up and went down, but texting was mostly used. When we were over in Port Alberta, we tried to take a little bit of everything, and we were texting. We were using the cell phones. We were trying not to use our communication systems, and as we found out, they weren't working anyway, which we knew they wouldn't. So we take these as tests. We're using technology in ways we've never used it before. We use FaceTime in all the scenarios. So wherever the scenario was, we had 10 scenarios set up in the city. Everything was FaceTime back to the command. So we knew exactly what was going on, how to set things up. So all these experiences have done nothing but strengthen our ability to get out the door, to help, and to move forward. And as I say, with this exercise that we did over Port Alberta, that takes us a big, big step moving forward.
Thank you, Kurt. That's great. Thank you very much for
Take care.
Thank you all for panelists' insights. It was great to hear about your experiences, your research, and collaboration, and the importance of communication. We'd like to open the floor to some questions, but first I want to ask Kurt and Joanna. I guess my question is, what's the biggest lesson you've learned from another country? From another country being either a disaster that's happened there, or a country that maybe you've been in communications with, or learned about their reports?
I guess I'll go first. I'll use my most recent one. That'll be Oslo, Washington. I don't know if everybody remembers the big slide that happened down in Oslo, Washington. So I was down there on the first day of that as well. The interesting thing about there is it's consistent across the board in its communication. What had happened was it was cut basically in half. There was the north side and the south side. The north and the south do not talk to each other. You think, okay, what's the big deal with that? Why is that an issue? Well, the issue was there were slides continuing to happen. So we were on the north side. We did not let the people on the south side who were in the muck know that there was an issue in possible slides. So that became a problem. So it's continuously communication. One of the other issues was going into a small town. The locals will not volunteer. The locals will be there, and that became a problem in the beginning because they were pushed away. You can't push the locals away. You've got to find something for them to do, because these could be their children, their family, their neighbors, and things like that. So that had to be taken care of very quickly. And they were, once the system was made out what they could actually help out to do, they were very happy with that, and they stayed. Coordination was a problem in the beginning as well, because what had happened, it was a logging town, and they had lots of heavy equipment. Well, that's great to help out, but the problem was, in several instances, they would be there scooping mud from one spot to the other side. They would go away on coffee, and somebody would come in and take this and put it back there. So the coordination was very takes time. And the other thing is, you got to realize what we were down there for. We were looking for a live search, which turned into there back and forth, so there has to be a coordinated effort. The sense of urgency has to slow down a little bit. You have to have a plan of what you're doing, what your objective is. This was about day 2, day 3 was taken care of, but in the beginning, everybody wants to help, but sometimes their help is actually not helping. So if somebody has to take control of that, I can only speak for the NBC, because that's who I work with all the time, is I think they're very, very well versed, very, very well dialed into these situations. But once again, it's going to take time for them to get there. If it's hundreds of miles away, they're not going to get there right away. Our team won't get there right away. So it's that communication in the beginning of what's your plan, what are you there for. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I probably came to the same realization from other countries that you did about how important communication is and how likely you are to be on your own for a long time. And I think that was the big takeaway for me in researching so many different countries who have gone through a major earthquake, is how important it is for the individual to be able to be on their own for a long time. And I kind of thought going into it, if we've got the best science out there, if we've got the best emergency plan from the government, if we've got the best search and rescue teams on the ground, then we should be the most prepared as long as I've got an earthquake kit and an earthquake plan. But in looking at these other countries, the cities and the countries that have been able to rebuild and get back to life the quickest are the ones where people took leadership in their own communities, in their own neighborhoods. And that was sort of a turning point for me when I decided I didn't just want to be a survivor and a burden to search and rescue crews on the ground, but I wanted to take a leadership role, and that sort of ended up empowering me, whether it's talking to your strata council about what the earthquake plan is, or taking first aid courses so that you can help the people in your neighborhood before the big help arrives. And you see examples in other countries, like big earthquake in China, in an area that is used to disasters like landslides and big storms. And after an earthquake a few years ago, I remember hearing stories of people, survivors, living in tents, so tent cities in their own neighborhood. And within a couple of days, they were sharing satellite phones so they could start their businesses up and running again. And somebody was, brewing a big pot of food to share with the community and getting kids back into a makeshift school. So, yeah, I think the big takeaway for me in looking at other countries is resiliency really depends on how prepared you are as an individual to take responsibility and a leadership role.
Thank you. We'll open the questions up to the floor. If anyone wants to start.
I'm probably one of the small minority quite well prepared personally, but the question I have is when you're talking about you're on your own for a few days, does that include maintaining order? Like, as I say, I look after myself and my family, but what about people that don't have anything and want to take what I've got? What sort of a plan do we have in place to deal with that? Or what do you advise people to do in their preparation to deal with that situation?
I think I can speak in the city of Vancouver, an employer. I think they have a very, very complex, very, very good plan for earthquakes. If you go onto the website, you take down pretty much everything you want to know, what you do, how to prepare. They have a team called the 18 Neighborhood Emergency Assistance Team. They have another one, Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Plan, which gets the people involved with what kind of plan they can help out making plans, and also instructing some other citizens in the city of what to do. On the other end of what you're getting at, there is plans, but once again, it depends how big. I mean, if you're talking something big and massive, there could be those problems, and how that's dealt with. Honestly, I don't know. They'll do the best they can, but I don't think there's an actual set plan.
Thank you for your honesty, and now I know what to do. Now that I know where we are.
Thanks. Hi. We know from the Vancouver Foundation and other studies about the challenge of isolation in our cities and in our towers and our condominiums and apartment buildings. What kind of work, so we already don't know our neighbors, what kind of work should we be doing, or should we be considering in working within those structures of people who don't even know the names of people 2 doors down. How do we factor that into building a post-event community?
That's a great question, and it's something that I started to look into during my research. And you mentioned the NEAT program. There are these programs in place, the Dunbar Group, different community and neighborhood organizations that I hope will be sharing their templates and ideas about how to organize neighborhoods or buildings. So the Dunbar Group and the NEAT Group are great places to start looking to see how.
Sorry, the Dunbar and the...
Dunbar Group and NEAT Group, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are two sort of neighborhood groups that have spent a lot of time figuring out how they will organize their community. But I sort of had this moment when I was doing all this research. I just moved into a new building, and I noticed by the elevator, normally in hotels and buildings, you've got the fire plan, and in this building, they have an earthquake plan, and I had never seen that before. And that was a bit of a moment where it's such a simple thing to do, but every time you're standing there waiting for the elevator, you know, read the fire plan 1,000 times, and if you have the earthquake plan there, even if it's just as simple as, you know, drop, cover, hold on, wait for the shaking to stop. If you're in this building, this is where we will meet, what park we will meet at when the earthquake stops shaking. Maybe it's you go to your strata meeting and decide you'll take on where your closest, emergency meeting spot is, or what park you'll gather at, or who has first aid in the building. This is something that I'm also looking into as well. I mean, apartments and condos are one thing. What about neighborhoods? You know, is there a time where all of the neighbors get together anyway? Is it flyers? Is it your soccer team instead, your kids' soccer club? So I know I have a lot of questions, but these are things that I'm wondering about as well. And like I said, there are just a couple of groups that are really starting to take a leadership role in figuring out how to get neighborhoods to work together.
One of the interesting things when you talk about the condominiums and the towers is the challenge facing in Calgary. And this maybe something I want to put into your plan is, in the beginning when the flooding came up, we allowed people to stay in the buildings because it didn't hit the floor. But now that became an issue because all of a sudden it's funny, people get hungry and people need food, and now they can't get out. So originally, when you had the opportunity to move them, they weren't moved. Now you don't have the resources when you put resources, because the resources are not endless. In the beginning, you have limited resources. So now you have a situation where you got to get people out of hotels, people out of towers. So this, I think, in our plan, we're definitely looking at it a little differently here now, but not just from education and experiences. So if you are building a plan, that's one thing you should have to decide on. Everybody should get out of the building. Not even after the and where do they go? There's another curve. So it's endless, the domino effects of what's going to happen in an emergency.
Just following up, the fire plan is prominent in most buildings, but I wonder if that a function could be a requirement in terms of codes, and wouldn't part of the answer be to ensure that the coding or zoning bylaws require that an earthquake plan is also as prominently displayed and prepared. So I mean that's I think an area maybe that needs to be developed a little more. Actually, the question I wanted to ask, it's unfortunate that Mr. Yamamoto was not here because maybe she would be most directly concerned, but I was wanting to know more about the federal government's responsibility in all this. It is an international disaster risk reduction agreement that Canada is party to, and it, I think, poses certain requirements on the country. And obviously, and Charles, you mentioned in your opening that the Kirk's outfit is the only one in Canada that's authorized by the UN Emergency Preparedness Coordinator to, in a sense, be involved on. So I just figured if either Kirk or Ron had any insights into how the federal level of government is involved in this effort.
I know how it is on the your exact question is too, I can't answer that one. So.
Yeah, it is a question we asked, and I know a lot of it falls on the provincial level and federally. Talking to other provinces, interestingly, I think a lot of their disaster plans are perhaps farther behind than BC's and other provinces that have had recent disasters like Alberta, Ontario and Quebec, I know at least from an earthquake perspective, are waiting to see how all of our plans come together and then might just use that template. They get earthquakes in Ontario and Quebec as well, so they're just going to wait for the plan and basically take that and implement it on a provincial scale. But I don't know exactly how the allocation goes federally.
I'm just back from a short visit to Japan, and I lived there for several years. And as you say, if you live in Tokyo, you get a reminder about 5 times a week. It depends on how high your building is. You always have tourists coming through who were staying at one of the high-rise hotels and woke up with a shock a couple of times a week. But of course, the buildings are built on rollers, and therefore they do move quite a lot when you're up on the upper stories. But Japan, of course, is, as you said, a whole lot more prepared than most countries because of the kind of experience they've had. The building we were staying in this time, we were up on the 9th floor of one of those apartment rental buildings, and every apartment out on the balcony had a little ladder. Not a very long ladder. It went down to the next floor, and then you got on another ladder and went down another floor. But that kind of preparedness, I don't see in Vancouver condos, and might be something to consider one of these days. I guess the biggest thing that Japan learned from the Tohoku earthquake and the tsunami was, don't build nuclear plants close to the coast. They really, you're right, to handle it as well as could be expected in very unexpected circumstances.
Just to follow up with that, I lived in Tohoku as well, and my town was washed away by the tsunami. So when you see the footage of the BBC of the buildings floating in the water, it's the town. And luckily I wasn't there for that. I just returned home, but it was surreal watching it. And one thing to follow up on your point is how prepared they are. Is I taught at an all-boys technical high school, and their project that year, their year-end project was actually building a model replica of the town. Tsunami wall that, like, when a certain amount of pressure would hit, there would be a wall that would come down and protect the fortress of the entire town. So it was on everyone's mind, even the youth were, in their very ways. And they also had signage up all throughout the town. Like, this is a tsunami zone, starts here. Here's the line. You're safe at this height. This is like a conservative estimate. You're not safe at this height. And when the event struck, the school was on a hill. So everyone who was at school that day was okay. It was people at the lower altitudes, right past that sign, who unfortunately passed away or injured. So just having those types of signage, I was thinking tsunami as well. Like, in which then you could put signs,
All the way down the California coast.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for your time today and your interesting presentations. To make things more interesting, I'm going to disagree with the last two commentators and suggest that the Japanese are very good at preparing for earthquakes, and they're not very good at preparing for the unintended consequences that come with earthquakes. And then I want to bring that back to Vancouver. So the last two major earthquakes in Japan were in Kobe and in Tohoku. In Kobe, more people died in the fires that followed than in the quake itself. And really, the coordination that you talked about, Kirk, was at the root of that. And then obviously in Tohoku, it wasn't the earthquake, and it wasn't the attendant tsunami. It was the nuclear power plant meltdown that's effectively ruined the economy of Fukushima Prefecture. So what are we doing to identify the gaps in our own resiliency here in Vancouver? I guess my question is, what do you see and I know Johnny mentioned liquefaction, possibly that's it. What are the things where we have gaps in our own planning and our own creation of resiliency to deal with those unintended down the line consequences?
No, it's a very good point. I mean, they certainly weren't a poster child for preparedness either. And you're right, it's these secondary disasters that often become a bigger deal, and fires are a huge concern after an earthquake. So specific to the South Coast, I think that we do have some unique challenges. First of all, that we don't get these reminder earthquakes that you guys mentioned. We don't have this muscle memory to deal with it. We live in a unique topography where we rely on key transportation structures like trains and bridges and a few key highways, and these are all at risk to be damaged potentially for a long time after an earthquake. So the concept of being isolated, maybe more than other parts of the world, is something that I think we have to deal with. And then liquefaction for sure. Many parts of Metro Vancouver, not just Richmond, parts of the North Shore even, have these areas in the sediment where they're at high risk for amplified shaking. And my answer is a scientific one. I think there are many different solutions, and that this is something that I'm interested in learning more about. But scientifically, I think hazard maps can be a big part of the solution. The North Shore has one, and Victoria is working on one, and it's basically getting all of the information we have about the buildings, the building codes, how old they are, what they're built out of, and then the soil structure, and that's where geologists come in. And I've seen the North Shore map, and it's basically color-coded right down to a street, and based on the hazards of the soil and the buildings. And then after an earthquake, first response teams know where they should go first to deal with areas that might be at higher risk. So I think hazard risks can be a big help, and I know on the top of the wish lists of most city preparedness officers, more hazard map, and hopefully that's something that will put more money into the universities. But yeah, it's a good question, a lot of questions.